Okay, Steph, if you want, I'm just going to go ahead and get started then. And we are already at 3:01. So I'll just go ahead and we'll just keep admitting people as they come in. So my name is Amy Bowie, and I am one of the subject librarians here at JPL. I am going to introduce you in just a sec to our speaker, but just a few little housekeeping notes at the beginning. As usual, we will be monitoring the chat throughout. So if you have any questions or anything, or just comments you want to make, feel free to just type them in the chat. We might not pick them up until afterwards during Q&A, but if you want to, just go ahead and type in there. We will be keeping track. And so I'm just going to go ahead and welcome all of you to this session, this afternoon book break. Today we're talking about LGBTQIA books and trends. And our speaker is going to be my lovely colleague, Steph Noell, who is our very own Special Collections Librarian at the UTSA Libraries. And Steph is also the chair of the 2021 Stonewall Book Awards. And if you're not familiar with the Stonewall Book Awards, they're a series of awards that the American Library Association gives out annually to English language books of exceptional merit that relate to LGBTQ experience. And Steph, when they are not chairing this committee, manages the Special Collections Instruction Program, collaborating with faculty in the development and implementation of instruction sessions for their courses that utilize special collections materials. In addition to instruction, Steph also manages the rare books collection, selecting, acquiring, and preserving rare books while maintaining rare book donor and vendor relations. So they're a very busy person. Steph also has an MS in Library and Information Science, as well as an MA in Environmental Philosophy from the University of North Texas, and a BA in Philosophy from the University of West Florida. And I hope I got everything. Yeah, so just impressive credentials. And I will go ahead and hand over the mic to Steph now, and I'll go ahead and I'll mute myself and turn off the camera, and the focus will be all on you from now on.
Thank you, Amy. So yes, my name's Steph Noell. I, as Amy said, I'm the Special Collections Librarian for UTSA. So I get to work with all the cool rare books, and I get to help people learn about all the amazing archival material that we have in special collections. So it's a pretty wonderful department to work for. Some of my colleagues are here. Melissa is pretty much our go-to person for preserving the history and legacy of San Antonio's queer community. So I just wanted to give her a shout out real quick. And so, yeah, if you want to learn about the history of San Antonio's queer community, first of all, Melissa's a great person to reach out to. Second of all, we have a lot of amazing materials and books in our department, if anyone's interested in any of that. But the topic of today is kind of the current state of queer lit. And I'm approaching this as the outgoing chair of one of the Stonewall Book Award committees. Our committee focused on adult fiction, and what this means is like anything. I mean, think of a fiction genre or format. If it's meant for adults, and it's in some way queer, we probably read it in the last 2 years. So I think each year we had around 250 nominations of books to be considered for the awards, which means I've spent the last 2 years just completely immersed in the current queer lit field. My background in reading is usually more along the lines of nonfiction and comics. So if I'm gonna read fiction, it's usually comic books, but otherwise I usually read like philosophy and history and stuff like that. So this was a really good experience for me because I really got to dive into areas of literature that I was not familiar with whatsoever, and I got a lot out of it. So if you're a big reader, you know, look out for a literature award committee. Maybe they have open volunteer, options. I was fortunate enough to be part of the American Library Association, which is the organization that gives out the awards every year. So that's how I ended up on the committee. So I was just on it the first year. So I just got to read the books and enjoy them and, talk about them with the rest of the committee. And then the second year I chaired it, which means I was chairing a book award committee during COVID, which was very weird. Lots of ebooks. The supply chains were not great. But yeah, so I wanted to get us started just talking about the books that we recognized this year, and then we can kind of talk about other books that came out last year that I wished had made our list. And we can also go back and talk about some of the 2019 books. It doesn't matter what area of fiction you read, I can probably recommend a queer book for you. So I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to look at this lovely guide that Tara set up. So this is our Barbara Gittings Literature Award research guide. So if you need the link, it's just libguides, libguides.utsa.edu/Gittings, Gittings. Barbara Gittings was an active member of the Rainbow Roundtable in the American Libraries Association. So this award was named for her in honor of all of her efforts. I don't know how much you'll spend on library internet, but one of my favorite American Libraries Association's moments from a conference was back in the 70s when they had, what was it? I think they had a kissing booth at the annual conference. So you could come and, someone's got to have a comment. Oh, thank you, Joaquin. So yeah, you could come and, kiss a lesbian, kiss, a gay man. And that was, back in the 70s, this is what we did at our library conference. It was great. So yeah, Barbara Gittings participated in that. So yeah, she was a very cool librarian. So I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up to our award winner for this year. And this is this is the full list that we went into our deliberations with. So I can start with the ones that didn't make it to our honors list, if that's okay with everybody. And then we'll move on to the honors list, and then we'll move on to the award winner. So Too Much Lip by Melissa Lukashenko was a really cool novel about an Indigenous woman, and just kind of growing up in like rural Australia, what that's like, and how the Indigenous community is treated, and the lack of resources available to them. So even though I'm not Australian, I've spent a good amount of my life, living paycheck to paycheck and, struggling. And I have I've lived in a lot of communities that were very similar, where you just kind of have to fight for each other. So yeah, it was a very beautiful book. Melissa Lukashenko is one of the most accomplished Australian authors out right now. She won one of their national book awards. So yeah, she's an incredible writer. And you get to learn a little bit about Australian culture, which is interesting. The subtweet by Vivek Shraya is very like Gen Z. It's very much focused on social media. So it was a little alienating to one or two of our committee members because they were just not social media people. But it's about a lot of things. It's about racism in the music industry and how, white artists are promoted over artists of color in a lot of circumstances. But then it also deals with colorism within the music industry. So, you've got these two brown artists, but one of them is lighter skinned, and the lighter skinned one ends up being the more popular of the two of them. And it, creates a wedge. And The wedge is illustrated by a subtweet. So it's about kind of how to deal with these kinds of relationships and deal with your place in a racist society, and managing all of that is a lot. So it was good. It's a very accessible book. I really enjoyed it. The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. If you are a fan of Call the Midwife, you're gonna love this book because it's about an Irish pandemic maternity ward during the 1918 pandemic. So you've got, a war going on. So, minimal doctors available. And then you've also got a pandemic going on. So you have a lot of people needing beds. And then you have, mothers who get the flu while they're pregnant. And, it's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking. There's a very good likelihood that you will cry when you read this, but it is very good. It's a beautiful book. Okay, so now we're getting into our top 5 for the year. Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth, if you're not familiar with it. This is one of those book within a book sort of narratives. So you've got kind of 2 different timelines that you're jumping back and forth between, but the kind of placeholder, the central part of the story is this land in New England. So it jumps back and forth between kind of like Victorian era on that land at this girls' school, and modern day where they're filming a movie on those grounds, and it's supposed to be about these women who went to and worked at the school. And yeah, it's nice to have a book that has queer joy. We don't always get those in narratives, so anytime I find instances of queer joy in any kind of media, I always appreciate it. And also, if you're like a lit nerd, if you're like super into literature, if you have an English degree or you're trying to get an English degree or a minor, this is a really good book for you because it is a technical achievement. So I think anyone who's really into like the technical aspects of literature and how you can construct narratives and construct books, this is a really good book to check out. All of my lit nerd friends who have read it have just absolutely loved it. So yeah, Plain Bad Heroines. Also, it deals with some of celebrity culture because they're filming a movie, and the kind of lead of the movie is the it girl. She's like kind of the Kristen Stewart of this book. So yeah, you've got also discussions of like having to market things using social media, so like this weird gray area of personal and professional. Yeah, so that was a really good one. Boys of Alabama, also a very beautiful book. I grew up in the Southeast, and actually I don't know. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Boys of Alabama is basically about a German kid, a gay German kid who moves to Alabama and becomes a football player. So, it's a lot of kind of adjusting to a new culture in a very masculine, hyper masculine culture. Very toxic in a lot of ways. And he also is kind of being recruited by the local judge slash, religious guru guy. So there's a lot of pressure to kind of conform to their Christian ideals. And at the same time, he's in love with this like goth kid who wears women's clothing and, you know, eye makeup and is kind of witchy. So, and there's also an element of magical realism to this book as well. I won't give away too much of it, but I'm a big fan of magical realism, so I liked that. I enjoyed that aspect of this book, but it's not like the whole thing. Post-colonial love poem. Okay, so now we're getting into our poetry. So the next two are just poetry volumes, but they're not just poetry volumes because they're amazing. So post-colonial love poem by Natalie Diaz is, what's the best way to put this? Okay, so this was the book that we were holding all the other books up to all year, basically. This is one of our early favorites. And it was a universal across the board, all 13 of us, you know, were absolutely in love with this book. It is beautiful, it's heartbreaking. She's, you know, she's, you know, discussing a lot of issues surrounding being Indigenous, being Latina, but also being queer. She has some beautiful, oh my God, just gorgeous poems. There's several poems in there that I would recommend reading to a lover. They're very beautiful, very sexy poems. And yeah, I still can't get over it. I'm not a poetry person, and this one just totally ate me up. I'm still blown away by it. So it's kind of like a lot of the things that we discuss, you know, a lot of the issues that we discuss around race and gender and sexuality in the US, like, you know, they're discussions, but this is like, she's like screaming it with every word in her arsenal. Just, so good. So it's one of those books that you're just going, yes, like the whole time you're reading it. And then you have another poetry collection, More Than Organs by K. Ulande Barrett. And this is a collection of poems that not only deals with what it is to be brown and queer and trans, but it also deals a lot with disability. And anytime I find a book that, you know, that's another kind of subject that I look for representation of. And so to have poems about, you know, hospital beds and have poems about identity all in the same volume are just, you know, it's really beautiful. And, you know, there's definitely some lines in here that just cut you right to your core. I mean, yeah, like they made me tear up with a single line. So yeah, absolutely gorgeous. And then we have a fellow Texan in Brian Washington. I don't know if any of y'all have read Brian Washington. He writes a lot of like food essays, but this is, I think, his second novel. And the first one we also considered last year, and it was very high up on our list. So Memorial is a book about a couple, a gay couple in Houston. And so you have an African-American man and a Japanese-American man. And they're not in a great place in their relationship. They're kind of in that period, like neither one of them really, they're just kind of there. They don't really have plans. But it's like a comfort thing. But Mike, the Japanese American guy, his mom comes to visit, but at the same time, he has found out that his dad is dying, so he flies to Japan. So basically, his mom gets there and he flies to Japan and leaves her with his boyfriend, which is not awkward at all. And it's a great book. So I'd say his first book, Lot, which came out in 2019, is very much about Houston as like a character in and of itself. Like you feel very much a sense of place in Lot. With Memorial, you still get that, but it's very much focused on food. And so you really get to celebrate a lot of Houston's what Houston has to offer food wise. Yeah, I just really enjoyed it. And also, you're dealing with parental death, and grief is something that was very well covered in this, and also in More Than Organs. So yeah, definitely pick up some Brian Washington. His stuff's beautiful, and if you're familiar with Houston, it's going to make it even better. And then we have Death of Vivek Ogee by Okweke Emezi. So this is a book about this family in Nigeria, and you've got Vivek, who is a trans woman, and her cousin who is in love with her. And so it's this story about, coming to terms with your identity. Vivek never really had a problem with that, but her cousin, had trouble coming to terms with his identity. But I think her coming out as trans probably helped him ease a lot of his like gay panic, I think. But it's a story about, queer love in Nigeria. Like, you're not gonna find a lot of stories like that. It's very lyrical, very poetic, very, very pretty, very well written. Yeah, and it's another one that might make you cry. And that brings us to our award winner for this year, The 30 Names of Night by Zane Shukadar. And this is a book that Zane has said that he really found himself writing, like, because he kept writing the main character as a girl and it just wasn't working. And then he kind of realizes, oh, I'm like closeting my own character. And so it becomes the story of this trans man in Little Syria in New York, in Manhattan. And his mother's died, and he's trying to kind of piece his life together, trying to kind of come into his own. And so he's coming to terms with his own identity as a trans man, but he's also trying to kind of solve this mystery for his mom, because his mom, an ornithologist, had seen this bird, and the only other known person who had seen this bird was a queer artist from decades before in Little Syria. And so he kind of jumps on this mystery to figure out if his mother and this artist saw the same bird, and if it is indeed a new species, an unidentified species. So it has a lot of like ornithological tones. So if you're like a birder, I'm kind of an amateur birder. I enjoy birds. I don't know what all of them are. But yeah, if you're a birder, or you just want to read about, a trans man's kind of path to self-discovery, and also him solving this mystery for his mom. Yeah, it's gorgeous. It's a beautiful book. It's one of those books that you just like, I don't know, it makes me feel kind of like warm and fuzzy a little bit. Yeah, so that's what I spent last year boiling over 250 books down to. And all of these are highly recommended. They're all gorgeous. I do have a few other books I can recommend that did not make it on here. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, so books that I wished had made it onto our top 10. I should have pulled up these beforehand, but I was not thinking about it. So first up, we've got Fiebre Tropical. So this is, there's a link to it. So this is a book about this Colombian girl who moves to Miami and falls for her pastor's daughter. And it's so richly written. I think the fact that the writer included Spanish in it so that it's not, it works better. It seems more authentic than trying to put it all in English. I don't know if that was why it didn't end up on our list, but there were several of us who were fighting hard for it because it's a beautiful book. And then if you're a sci-fi nerd, I would recommend The Seep by Shauna Porter, which is, let me find. So The Seep is about this trans woman of color who's, okay, so let me actually give you a little bit of world building. So this trans woman of color lives in this world where this alien species called the Seep has kind of embedded itself in our world. So everyone has the Seep in them, and you can make modifications kind of on a whim. So her wife decides that she wants to become a baby again, and she wants to go through the whole process of life all over again. So main character's like, I'm sorry, I can't raise you. That is, and so she ends up getting adopted by this family in India. But yeah, it's like you can do stuff like that. But there's discussions. So because you can do things on a whim, some people will take up identities. Like there's another guy who takes up the identity of his dead lover, but his dead lover was Black and he's white. So it's like, and so there's like a whole thing. But yeah, it's a really cool book. Also, if you're into sci-fi, there was a 2019 book that I loved that's also very poetic, very lyrical, and it's called This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El Mohtar and Max Gladstone. And this is very much one of those books where you've got characters on, yeah, it's so good. You've got characters on both sides of a war, and it's like the organics versus the synthetics, and kind of two of the top generals on each side fall in love with each other. So they leave each other notes across time. So they'll like jump to find one another, and there's like some crazy note that I can't even explain at this point because it's been 2 years since I read that book and I can't remember an example of what their notes would do, but it was always very elaborate notes that you had to like ingest to be able to read or something like that. Yeah, but it was such a cool book. It's one of those books that just like that and The Seep, I would say, are both books that are very cinematic. Like you can almost see them in your head as you're reading them. And for those of us that don't do that every time they read, it's significant when we find a book that does that for us. Also this year, we read this great book called Exile Music by Jennifer Steele. Maybe Style. Steil. And this is about a queer Jewish girl in Austria in the 1930s. And her best friend, she has to leave behind. Her best friend whom she's in love with, she has to leave behind to escape the Nazis. So she and her family moved to Bolivia. And yeah, it's one of those books it's because it's fiction, but it's based in history. It's one of those books that like I want to go back and like compare the timelines with historical events. The Pull of the Stars is like that too. And yeah, so if it's okay with y'all, I'll be happy to talk about some of the 2019 books. Or if y'all want, we can go ahead and start doing questions, and if they come up, they'll come up.
Whichever one you prefer.
Does anybody have any questions?
I have a list of questions for you, but if no one has questions yet, you can talk about the 2019 books and people can start typing in their questions.
Okay, we can talk about the 2019 books. Okay, so for 2019, hold on, I have to think about, yeah. Sorry, I'm having to like remember what we talked about in 2019. Give me just a second. So, oh yeah, that's right, Cantordos. Sorry, I had to remember what one, because this was a year, so both years I've been on this committee, we'll have our top two, and we just have enough people on each side that want each, that it ends up being like a 24-hour discussion about which one's gonna win. And that's what happened that year too. So it was between Lot and Cantordos, and Cantordos won. So let me grab that. So Cantordos is a book by Carolina de Robertis, and so this is just a gorgeous book about Uruguay, specifically a queer community of women in Uruguay during the dictatorship, and how it was to go from pre-dictatorship and having, you know, more freedom to at least be different, not even necessarily be yourself, but just to be different from other people. And to go to living under a dictatorship and having to kind of find, you know, your own, like make your own queer spaces, because there weren't any. So you have this group of women who buy a beach house in the fishing village, and that's their sanctuary. And it becomes kind of a generational sanctuary almost for queer women. And yeah, so it was just a really incredible book. And Cantordos is specifically how women in Uruguay who would refer to other queer women. They're like, oh, is she a cantora? Because that's like an old way of saying singer. So she's like, yeah, is she a cantora? Can she make women sing? So yeah, that's what Cantoros refers to. We already talked about Lot. Lot is, well, we talked a little bit about Lot. So Lot by Brian Washington is, yeah, that's much more focused on Houston, and you know, kind of it deals a lot with the Afro Latinx experience, because the focus of it is a mixed guy. So yeah, that's just beautiful, beautiful representation of Houston. Let's see. And then we also had War Torn, which was, I think, one of our, yeah, that was the only collection of poetry in our top 5 in 2019. And that is a poetry volume about being queer and also being Muslim, and you know, kind of finding yourself in, you know, in your culture, but also as yourself. And we also had On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vong, which was what we would call an epistolary book. It's written as a letter to his mother, and on top of, you know, the trauma of kind of growing up queer in environments that don't always want you there, you also have you know, an immigrant mother. She's from Vietnam, and all of the trauma that comes from, you know, being in the middle of a war and fleeing from it and trying to find a home where you can safely raise your family, but, you know, you can't really leave all of that trauma behind. And in a lot of cases, it becomes kind of intergenerational trauma. Ocean Vuong is typically a poet, so his novel, oh my God, it is so gorgeous. Just beautiful, beautiful. And then we also had Patsy by Nicole Denny Ben, and that is, it's a hard book because it's one of those books where you don't necessarily like one of the main characters. Patsy, the title character, is a mother who is, as she's gotten older and her daughter is getting older, her daughter's 10 when the book starts, she's coming to terms with the fact that she's always been in love with her best friend who moved to New York and is, like, you know, very well-to-do. And she's stuck back in Jamaica, where they grew up. And so she decides to kind of run off to New York and try to make a life in America, but she leaves her daughter behind. So it's a hard book to read at that part, but her daughter also grows up to be queer, and I believe at the end, well, I won't spoil anything, but anyway, it's, as someone who went to college with a lot of Jamaican women, and I knew a lot of queer Jamaicans, like, I just want to send this to so many of them, because there's so much that you have to hide. And I mean, I know we all do to a certain extent, but, like, you know, different cultures, it's, you know, to different extremes. And a lot of my friends, you know, they stayed in America because they couldn't be themselves back home. Yeah, so Patsy's great. The sole comic book that we had on either of our top 10 lists in the last 2 years was Is This How You See Me by Jaime Hernandez. And if you're a comic books fan, especially independent comic books, you're probably familiar with the Hernandez brothers. So, and Jaime was always my favorite. But this is a great book for especially, oh my God, older queers, because coming back and looking back on like your life as a younger person versus, you know, having to be an adult and have like families and stuff. Yeah, you want to go back and be that like 20-year-old punk, but you also, yeah, Love and Rockets is amazing. But you also like have obligations that you have to, you know, stick with. So it's great. I loved it. I'm a queer kid that grew up in the punk scene, so this was like written for me. And we already talked about This Is How You Lose the Time War. I have another collection of poetry for y'all that did not make it onto our top 5 last year, but was also incredible. Wwjd and Other Poems by Savannah Sipple. Savannah Sipple is becoming a pretty accomplished poet. I see a lot of her stuff in collections and periodicals. But this is a really good collection for anybody who kind of grew up queer in a rural Christian community. Yeah. So, because this is, I think Savannah Sipple grew up in Arkansas, and I know it's published in Arkansas. But yeah, that is a very unique experience for anybody, especially if you're, you know, part of the LGBTQ community. And a lot of the people on our committee that year who grew up, you know, in kind of rural settings, really, this book really meant a lot to them. Let me see. So we also had A People's History of Heaven by Mathangi Subramanian. And this is a book about a group of girls living in a slum and, you know, in Bangalore, and trying to just survive. It is, yeah, that was one of my favorite books from 2019. It's a really fun read. Oh, also one more. I'll do 3 more recs and then we'll move to Q&A, if that's okay. I have another sci-fi book. It's a collection of short stories called Sooner or Later Everything Falls into the Sea by Sarah Pinsker, who is becoming my new favorite sci-fi writer. And it has a great, like, I think the story that she might be most well known for is the one at the end where she has a conference of all of her alternate universe selves. And Mostly Dead Things by Kristen Arnett, if you're a big fan of dark humor. It's a lot of fun. I grew up in Florida, so it's based in Florida, and you know, it's its own. Yeah, Kristen Arnett's amazing. Kristen Arnett is one of those librarians I want to have a beer with. She's a librarian and she's a queer author. She's amazing. Totally want to have a beer with her. And then this wasn't on our list, but I've recommended it to some of my ACE friends. So if you're interested in a romance novel that involves an ACE character, this one, it's a book review. Okay, I'm gonna have to post a book review because I'm not quickly finding the book's website. But Play It Again by Aiden Wayne is great. It's about kind of 2 YouTubers who find each other. One is a bisexual, blind reviewer of like restaurants and, you know, kind of places ADA acceptance, and an Irish gamer who's asexual. So yeah, it's a very sweet book. And I will stop talking now so we can take questions.
Okay, so at this point, like, again, if you have questions, you can type it in the box, or you can just unmute yourself and talk over me. I don't mind that. But I do have a list here that we've been gathering. So I'll just start with the first question right here. So what were some of the criteria that you considered when looking for great queer books? And can you talk about what you look for personally?
Sure. So for me, when you're reading 250 books, it's got to grab you. So, you know, I would, if somebody really liked a book, I would give it a second look. But for me, as a slow reader, and yeah, that's, you know, that was something that I had to be conscious of, because I was the one that had to make sure that every book had a pair of eyes on it. So I didn't finish 250 books, but I started most of them. But in terms of what makes a great queer book, I think having something that we haven't seen before is always going to catch my eye. And so a lot of that comes in the form of representation. So for me, it's like, who's being promoted, and not just narrative wise, but also author wise. So, you know, we wind up doing a lot of research on the books that we like to see which one's going to be the best representation of queer lit for this year. And we also try to make sure that independent presses are, we're reaching out to independent presses so that smaller presses can have their books reviewed as well. But yeah, so for me, it's like, it has to be something new. It has to be something authentic, you know. It can't just be a rehash of something we've seen a billion times. You know, you really want it to move you. Because I mean, there's plenty of fun, fluffy books that are just fun, and that's great. I love that we have ample, fluffy adult queer fiction. This is a good situation to be in. But yeah, for our kind of considerations, we're definitely looking for books that move you and are something new.
All right, thank you. So for the next question, there's a note that it is a bit personal, so but I'll read it out. It's did taking such a deep dive into queer literature have any influence on the way you thought about queer identity and your own identity? If so, are you comfortable with talking about how it affected your thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm comfortable talking about it, and it absolutely affected, you know, my own relationship to my identity. You know, I think that for me, like, I came out when I was 13, and I was told that I couldn't date women or I wouldn't be allowed to stay with my family anymore. So anything past that, I really just didn't explore, because yeah, like, I was trained from an early age to know that, like, I'm not good enough and I'm not welcome with my own family if I'm going to be myself. So I think that reading a lot of these books has really caused me to reflect on my own identity and say, okay, well, I was right there. I know that that's correct. And so, like, in terms of my sexual identity, nothing's changed, but it really forced me to focus on my gender identity a lot more than I had, because, you know, I didn't want to think about that. I didn't want to have those conversations with my family, because I didn't exactly go great the last time. And yeah, and I think that being on this Lit Award in a pandemic has caused me to be even more introspective and I ended up coming out as non-binary this year. So that's, you know, that's I guess one of the products of this.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. So the next question we have is, how can the UTSA community access some of the books that you recommended, and are any of them available in our collection?
Some of them are, and I did link to the ones, some of them we have like ebooks for, so in our research guide that we set up for the Gittings committee, there are some links to ebooks or books that we have, but we also have links to other institutions where you can get it, like the public library, and oh yeah, and Bexar County Bibliothèque. Yeah, so there are links to which copies we have, and then there's also links to other places that you could potentially get them, other libraries. So yeah, but I'll probably add links to the ones that I linked in the chat too.
Okay, so let me read the next question. So after reading all of these books, are there any patterns that you started to notice?
It's hard because it's so many different types of lit. I mean, how do you compare a poetry collection or like a chapbook to, you know, a novel? You know, it's hard. It's hard to compare. Yeah, I think it would be, I don't know. I haven't thought about the themes of. I mean, there are certainly themes in a lot of them. Themes of grief, themes of struggle, themes of, you know, especially struggling with your identity, or struggling with others. You know, thoughts of who you should be. So, I mean, there are themes in the sense that like these are shared experiences that a lot of us have. But I don't feel like it's gotten too tropey yet. So there's not a whole lot of stuff that is being overdone. I mean, I'm sure there is in the romance sector for sure. Oh yeah, if you're like a big romance nerd, there's tons of queer romance novels out there, by the way. Oh my god, I can make some recommendations. And they also have some of the, you know, the most fun representation. Like there was this one book that I remember from 2019 called Flannelwood, and it was about a disabled vet who falls in love with, you know, a guy, like a bear. But yeah, so it's like this like very masculine romance novel. I love it. And again, you have disability representation, and like I love it. And so like and Play It Again was the same way. It was just a really sweet romance novel, but you also have like a blind protagonist and a male bisexual, like who many people would argue don't exist. So yeah, it's like some of the romance novels have some of my favorite representation.
Yeah, I feel like romance novels can sometimes be underrated. Like I don't read romance myself, but like I know they get a lot of flack, and it's undeserved sometimes. Well, we have another question here. So if somebody wanted to be in a committee like this, but isn't a member of an organization such as ALA, how can they look for or find opportunities?
So if you're not a member of like a professional organization that might have a book committee that you can join, I mean, I'd just Google like literature awards volunteer opportunities, and I'm trying to think, because like I'm trying to think of like non-affiliated, like organizations that do awards that are not affiliated with a professional organization. Because all the ones I'm thinking of are like Lambda and other awards that are affiliated with professional organizations. Yeah, maybe the San Antonio or Texas Book Festivals would be good. Oh yeah, Lone Star Zine Fest is this weekend, by the way, everyone. So, and it's all virtual this year. So if you want to check out some zines.
I didn't even know that was happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it got moved a little bit because of Snowpocalypse.
Oh, yeah. While you're looking at that, do you have any lesbian romance novel recommendations?
I have like a publisher I can recommend actually, because they do, that's like all they do. Let me pull up my spreadsheet. If it will come up. Okay, there we go. So I'll note as soon as I see it. Give me just a sec.
I'm surprised you even have a spreadsheet.
Oh, you have to.
I'm like frantically Googling every time.
No, you have to for this, because it's like there's so many books. Okay, not that. Bella Books, that's what it was. Bella Books. So Bella Books is entirely lesbian romance.
Oh, thank you. I don't know you saw that comment in the chat stuff, but one last stop by Casey McQuiston comes out over the summer.
Very cool.
Yeah. And I guess it's about time to wrap it up, but let me see. I'm gonna ask like just the group in general. We did this again. What kinds of books do you want us to cover? And just one last question for Steph. If you could write a book about the LGBTQ experience, what would you write about?
I think I would go somewhere along the lines of like of Jaime Hernandez. Like I would love to do a comic book, but I'm not an artist. If I could find an artist who would do it, I would love to further explore the queer punk scene, because I think for me, being like that kind of alt kid, I didn't feel represented in a lot of queer media. And so for me, it's like, oh, thank you, Melissa. Yeah, so for me, it's like I want something like that, because I can only find that in like the Hernandez brothers and zines for the most part. So that's something that I would love to see more of.
Cool. Well, thank you for giving us this talk today. I had a lot of fun. I hope everyone else did too. And if people want to contact you, are you okay with like leaving your email?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you have any questions for Steph, you can contact them at this email address. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And I guess we're just going to end right here, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.